Hello, and welcome to the second in a series of webinars on the Equity in IDEA Final Rule. The first webinar on the Equity in IDEA Final Rule was an overview of the Final Rule itself. This webinar is going to be on implementing the Final Rule. I'm Ruth Ryder, and I'm the Acting Director of the Office of Special Education Programs, and I'm joined today by Michael Gross and Richelle Davis, who will be providing more in-depth information on the Final Rule. In addition, we have released a Q&A document on the Equity in IDEA Final Rule, and the first webinar and the Q&A document and this webinar can be found on OSEP Ideas That Work under Significant Disproportionality. Today we're going to have a recap of the Final Rule, and if you can go to the next slide. I'm going to do a very quick recap of the Final Rule. Then I'm going to turn it over to Richelle to talk about the standard methodology, and Michael will talk about remedies and dates, and then I'll wrap it up with a little bit of information about how to provide us with any questions. Next slide. The Final Rule, the Equity in IDEA Final Rule on Significant Disproportionality, was published in the Federal Register on December 19th and became final on January 18th. Next slide. The statute, the IDEA statute, requires states to annually collect and examine data to determine whether significant disproportionality based on race or ethnicity is occurring in the state and in LEAs of the state. And states are required to look at identification of children as children with disabilities, including identification of children with disabilities with particular impairments. States are also required to look at placement of children in particular education settings and looking at disciplinary actions, including incidence, duration, and type of action, including suspensions and expulsions. And that is all in the statute. Next slide. The Final Rule requires states to use a standard methodology to look at those items that I just listed. And if the state determines that there is significant disproportionality, there are certain actions that the state needs to take, which we will discuss further. But the standard methodology requires that states use a risk ratio or an alternate risk ratio analysis. And as part of the standard methodology that states develop, and they need to develop this standard methodology involving their stakeholders, and particularly their state advisory panel. And the standard methodology includes a reasonable risk ratio threshold, a reasonable minimum cell size, and a reasonable minimum N size. Next slide. The rule includes a rebuttable presumption related to cell size and N size. And when we're talking about cell size, we're talking about the numerator, and when we're talking about N size, we're talking about the denominator. So the rebuttable presumption is that if a state has a minimum cell size of no greater than 10, so 10 or less, and a minimum N size of no greater than 30, so that's 30 or less, we would consider that to be reasonable. Next slide. There are also a couple of other flexibilities. We have called them the multi-year flexibility and the reasonable progress flexibility. So the multi-year flexibility allows states in developing their standard methodology to use up to 3 years of data before identifying an LEA with significant disproportionality. The second flexibility is reasonable progress, and the reasonable progress flexibility allows states to not identify LEAs if they are demonstrating reasonable progress in lowering the applicable risk ratios in each of the 2 prior consecutive years. So that gives credit to districts that are making progress in reducing their level of racial or ethnic disproportionality. Next slide. The Equity in IDEA final rule includes some new requirements related to Comprehensive Coordinated Early Intervening Services, or comprehensive CEIS. LEAs that are identified with significant disproportionality are required to reserve 15% of their IDEA funds for comprehensive CEIS. And they are allowed to use the comprehensive CEIS funds to serve students ages 3 through grade 12 with and without disabilities. And that is different than previously, where they were not allowed to use the comprehensive CEIS funds for preschool children, and they were not allowed to use the CEIS funds for children with disabilities. So now they can use funds for children ages 3 through grade 12 with and without disabilities. And the students without disabilities are those students who are struggling learners. They also are required to identify and address the factors that may contribute to the significant disproportionality. So in looking at how they are using their comprehensive CEIS funds, LEAs are required to do a root cause analysis to determine the factors that have contributed to significant disproportionality and determine how they can best use those funds to address those factors. Next slide. I mentioned earlier that the rule was published in the Federal Register on December 19th and became effective on January 18th, 2017. So the final rule is now effective, but the rule was structured in a way that it gives states 18 months to prepare, to work with their state advisory panel, and to make decisions regarding their methodology and their implementation of the comprehensive CEIS. So states must demonstrate compliance by July 1st, 2018, and we're going to talk a little bit later about what that compliance looks like. I'm going to turn it over now to Richelle, who is going to walk us through more details on the standard methodology.
Great, thank you, Ruth. And so we're going to take a look, as Ruth just said, a little bit more in depth at the standard methodology. And so before we start, however, I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom right-hand corner where it shows Q&A B2-1. Each of these slides have the label for the question and answer. So if you would like to go back and map it back to the frequently asked questions, you can do that. So let's begin. As Ruth had mentioned, this is all based on a risk ratio. And so as we're talking about risk is a proportion expressing likelihood. For example, if we had 40 Hispanic children identified as a student with a disability, and then we had 200 total Hispanic children in LEA, the risk of a Hispanic child being identified as a child with a disability is 20%, or 40 divided by 200. So when we talk about a risk ratio, we're comparing two risks. So we're looking for the likelihood of the outcome for one group versus the outcome for all others in the LEA. So we have the same 40 Hispanic students who are identified as a child with a disability divided by the 200 total Hispanic children in the LEA, and that is divided by 200 all other students who are identified as a child with a disability, and then the 2,000 other students in the LEA, 2,000 other races in the LEA. And so when you do that, you come up with a risk ratio of 2.0, which would be your 20%, or 0.2 divided by 0.1, and so you come up with 2.0. So when we talk about risk ratios, what we're talking about, again, is the likelihood. So a risk ratio of 2.0 suggests that something is 2 times as likely to occur. At the same time, a 3.0 would suggest that something is 3 times as likely to occur, and this continues on to infinity. So as Ruth had mentioned, one of the key factors of the standard methodology is that it requires a risk ratio threshold. And this risk ratio threshold allows a state and LEA to determine what is significant disproportionality. So in this case, that is a risk ratio that is above the risk ratio threshold. If it's above the risk ratio threshold, you have significant disproportionality in your LEA. States are required to set reasonable risk ratio thresholds in consultation with their stakeholders, including their SAP. So as we talk about risk ratio thresholds, one of the questions we get asked is how many risk ratio thresholds are states required to set? And so that number is 14, and that's one for each category of analysis, which we'll talk about here in a second. States may set different risk ratio thresholds for each category of analysis as reasonable. They may not set different thresholds for different racial or ethnic groups, and they may also not set racial quotas for any category of analysis. So as we talk about the categories of analysis, I'm not going to read through these for you, but in general, we have the 7 areas of identification. So as was already mentioned, the identification is a child with a disability, and then 6 particular impairments. We have 2 placements, and so in particular that's students who are in a regular class less than 40% of the day, and those students who are in separate schools and residential facilities. And then we have 5 areas of discipline, including in-school and out-of-school suspensions for greater than and less than 10 days, as well as total disciplinary removals. Excuse me. Each of these categories of analysis are applied to 7 racial ethnic groups. And so in this case, we have Hispanic, Latino, or any race, and for the individuals who are non-Hispanic, Latino only, we have American Indian and Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, white, and 2 or more races. And again, for each of these 7 racial or ethnic categories, you're calculating the risk ratio against each of the 14 categories of analysis. So, what is it that we must set in regards to the standard methodology? Well, states must set, in consultation with their SAP, the risk ratio threshold, as we've already discussed, and what else? Well, one of those things is a reasonable minimum cell size, which we'll talk about in a moment, a reasonable minimum N size, the number of years an LEA must exceed the risk ratio threshold in order to be identified. Based on the regulation, that's up to 3 years is an option. And then they must also define their definition of reasonable progress, which is also optional. These are the 2 flexibilities that Ruth had mentioned earlier. So as we talk about cell sizes and N size, well, what is a cell size? So as you look at the example here, we have a cell size is essentially the risk numerator. So you're going to have 2. You're going to have the risk numerator, which is 40 Hispanic children identified as a student with a disability, and then the other risk numerator, which would be considered the cell size, would be the 200 of all other races that were identified as a student with a disability. And then for our N size, that's the risk denominator. And so in this case, you'd have 200 total Hispanic children in the LEA, and then the alternate risk, the other N size would be the 2,000 other racial or ethnic group children that are in the LEA. And so that's the cell size and then the N size, and each of those would be required to have a threshold set on them. So why do we have these cell sizes and N sizes? Well, one of the biggest reasons that we have this is because risk ratios can produce unreliable or volatile numbers when applied to small populations. And it's very important to the department that determinations of significant disproportionality should not turn on whether or not there's a small demographic change. So what do we mean by this? Let's consider a small LEA. For this small LEA, the risk ratio threshold for Native Hawaiian students identified as a student with a disability is 3.0. And so in this case, we're looking at this particular idea, and we have 4 Native Hawaiian students identified as a student with a disability, and 8 total Native Hawaiian students in the LEA, so we get a risk of 0.5. And then for all other students, we have 10 children identified as a student with a disability divided by 50 students who are not Native Hawaiian children in the LEA. And so in this case, you get a risk ratio of 2.5. Well, what happens if at the end of the next year, 2 Native Hawaiian students with disabilities were to move into the LEA? So in this case now, we have 6 Native Hawaiian children identified as a student with a disability divided by the 10 total Native Hawaiian children in the LEA. And so in this case, you get 0.6 is the risk for a Native Hawaiian student being identified as a children with a disability. And then the for all other students, it would be 10 children identified divided by 50 of all other races. And so that would be still a 0.2. And so in this case, we have 3.0, which is the significant disproportionality threshold. So with the increase of 2 students, we've now, this LEA has now met the significant disproportionality threshold set in their state. So as you can see from this example, there is a lot of volatility when we're looking at small numbers. And so that's why we have the idea of minimum cell sizes and n sizes. And as noted, they must be reasonable, and they must be based on the advice of stakeholders. With that being said, minimum n sizes that are 10 or less and minimum n sizes that are 30 or less are presumed to be reasonable. And so as we move through, minimum cell and n sizes must be set, though cell sizes of a 0 or a 1 and n sizes of 1 are okay. States may set different minimum cell and n sizes for different categories of analysis. They may not, however, set different minimum cell sizes and n sizes for different racial or ethnic groups. So, as was already mentioned, the alternate risk ratio is another aspect of the final rule. And like a risk ratio, it is a comparison of risk. Unlike the typical risk ratio where we're looking within the LEA, the alternate risk ratio is the likelihood of the outcome for one group versus the outcome for all others in the state. So we're comparing the risk of an LEA for a particular group to the outcome for all others in the state. And this is done because sometimes the comparison group does not meet the minimum cell or n size. So the comparison group is that all other races group. So let's give an example. In this case, the state has set a minimum cell size of 5 and a minimum n size of 30. 490 out of the 500 students in the LEA are American Indian or Alaskan Native, and the number of other students in the comparison group, therefore, would be 10. So, as we put out our number here, we have 70 American Indian or Alaskan Native children identified as a student with a disability out of 490 total American Indian, Alaska Native children in the LEA. And so that obviously does not meet the minimum cell and n size because you don't have enough in the denominator there. And so we have to look at the state, and in this case, the state has 520,000 children identified as a student with a disability out of 3,640,000 of all other students in the state. And so as you look at the alternate risk ratio, you come up with 1.0. So we have the discussion of flexibility or the multiple years of data. And so that's one of the flexibilities that's built in. And so states may choose up to 3 years of data to make determinations of significant disproportionality. Much like the setting of thresholds for cell and n sizes, it's because risk ratios can be volatile and because systemic change can take time. So let's look at this. In school year 2019-20, a state has set a risk ratio threshold for identification of 3.0, and it requires an LEA to exceed the threshold for 3 consecutive years. So as we look at our table here, we note that LEA 1 does not exceed it in the first year, exceeds it in the second year, but does not exceed it in the third year. LEA 2, however, exceeds it in the first year, exceeds it in the second year, and exceeds it in the third year. Because of this, only LEA 2 would be determined to have significant disproportionality in identification, even though that LEA 1 does have the risk ratio of 3.3 in the second year. So the other flexibility is the idea of reasonable progress. Much like the years of data, it is optional. I mean, you have to use at least 1 year of data, but going clear to 3 is your option. Reasonable progress is also optional. If an LEA is above a risk ratio threshold, but is managing to lower the risk ratio for the 2 prior consecutive years, states need not find for significant disproportionality. Specific details of how much a risk ratio must be lowered will be determined by the state in consultation with stakeholders, including the SAP. And again, the reason why we're doing this is, given the time that it takes to make systemic change, we don't really want to interrupt something that's working. So let's take a look at an example of reasonable progress. So the state has set a risk ratio threshold for identification. The state has defined reasonable progress to mean a year-to-year decline in a risk ratio of 0.5. And so let's look at this example. LEA 1 in year 1 had a risk ratio of 4.9, much like LEA 2. In the second year, LEA 1 had gone down to 4.3, and LEA 2 had gone down to 3.6. But by the third year, however, LEA 1 had gone down to a 3.6, and LEA 2 had risen back up to a 4.3. In this example, only LEA 1 managed to decrease their risk ratio by 0.5 across all 3 years. So in this case, in school year 2021 and 2022, the state does not need to find significant disproportionality for identification in LEA 1. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Gross, and he's going to discuss some of the remedies in various states that will be important for the implementation of this rule.
Thanks, Richelle, and this brings us to slide 33. Okay, so the state has done all of the calculations for all of its LEAs, and some LEAs are above the risk ratio threshold and some LEAs are below. So what happens when an LEA is above a risk ratio threshold and the state determines that there is significant disproportionality in the LEA? Well, at that point, the statute calls for a number of remedies. The state must provide for the review and, if appropriate, the revision of policies, practices, and procedures. The state must require the LEA to publicly report on any revisions, if those are made, and require the LEA to set aside 15% of its IDEA Part B funds for comprehensive CEIS. So let's visit those in a little more detail. Slide 34. If an LEA is determined to have significant disproportionality, then it must, right, or the state must rather, provide for the review of policies, practices, and procedures. That has to be done every year in which the LEA is identified with significant disproportionality. Those review and revisions are done specifically to ensure compliance with the requirements of IDEA. And note the phrasing in the statute here, while the states must provide for the review, that doesn't mean that the state needs to do the review itself. It can have other parties, such as the LEA, do the review. Slide 35, continuing with the more detailed discussion of policies, practices, and procedures. When you do the review, what might you review? What do you review? Well, if we're talking about the identification of children as children with disabilities, we might review the child find and evaluation procedures and policies. If, for example, we're talking about the discipline of children with disabilities, we might review the policies and procedures about manifestation determinations, functional behavioral assessments, behavioral intervention plans, or disciplinary rules. Slide 36. Most of the questions we've received so far deal with the remedy of comprehensive CEIS, and that's not surprising since that's where the money is involved. with comprehensive CEIS, that's where the recent regulations have made the most significant change to existing policies. What hasn't changed, though, is really what comprehensive CEIS is, and that's defined as a broad range of activities that include professional development and educational and behavioral evaluation services and supports. For example, functional behavioral assessments, behavioral intervention plans, positive behavioral interventions, and supports. What has changed is who may be served by comprehensive CEIS. Under the new regulations, comprehensive CEIS may serve children ages 3 through grade 12, both with and without disabilities. That's an expanded group of children from the previous rule. That said, there are some limitations on how the service goes. We cannot use comprehensive CEIS to serve only children with disabilities. Slide 38 now. And the comprehensive CEIS must address the factors contributing to the significant disproportionality in the LEA for the identified category. So they are, in this sense, targeted and not unlimited in their use. Slide 39, okay, what does that mean to address factors contributing to the significant disproportionality? Well, that can mean a lot of different things, and it's going to depend on the individual circumstances within the LEA, but they might include children's lack of access to quality instruction. They might include the economic, cultural, linguistic barriers to appropriate identification or placement. They might include children's lack of access to appropriate screenings. Slide 40, we talk about the money. When an LEA is determined to have significant disproportionality, the LEA is required to reserve 15%, no more, no less, of its IDEA Part B subgrant. That said, the LEA may reserve the 15% from its Section 611 funds, its Section 619 funds, or both, at the LEA's discretion. Slide 41. That completes the summary of the remedies. Now let's talk about the dates, how this is going to unfold. Slide 42. Ruth mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that the effective date of these regulations was January 18th, 2017. Now, in the world of the Federal Register and federal rulemaking, that means something peculiar. That only means the date that the regulations were placed in the Code of Federal Regulations. That does not mean necessarily that a regulated entity has to start complying with the rule at that date. And in this case, it does not. The compliance date for this rule, slide 43, is July 1, 2018. This is the date by which states must comply with the regulations and begin using the standard methodology to determine whether significant disproportionality exists in its LEAs. That said, there's an exception, and the exception is that states need not include analysis of significant disproportionality for children 3 to 5 until 2 years following July 1, 2020. Slide 44. Okay, so we advance the calendar to July 1, 2018. What do we do and what have we had to do? Slides 45 and 46, right? By July 1, 2018, the beginning of school year 2018-2019, states must be ready to implement the standard methodology. Right? So in school year 18-19, the states will begin making determinations of significant disproportionality using the risk ratios risk ratio thresholds, cell sizes, n sizes, numbers of years of data, etc., that they have in consultation with their stakeholders, including state advisory panels, set. Right? Now, this may mean using data from the three prior school years, 2015-16, 2016-17, and 2017-18, and it may mean refiguring or recalculating some of the data from those years because most states will not have the standard methodology in place now. That is something that will simply disappear over time. When we get further down the line, the three prior years will all be done with the standard methodology and no figuring or refiguring or recalculating will be necessary. Slide 46. So the preparatory work, right, involved in getting to this point, by the beginning of school year 2018-19, states will have consulted with their SAPs to develop reasonable risk ratio thresholds, minimum n sizes, minimum cell sizes, standards for measuring reasonable progress, if any. Those need not be submitted to the department for pre-approval. Slide number 47, right? And so by school years 2018-2019, states will have amended any necessary policies and procedures to comply with the significant disproportionality regulation and begin using the standard methodology. Right? In the event that a state determines an LEA has significant disproportionality in school year 18-19, right, the reservation of 15% for comprehensive CEIS doesn't take place until the following school year. And slide 48, right, at some point states will have to report via the Part B LEA maintenance of effort reduction in CEIS data collection what LEAs in the state have reserved 15% for comprehensive CEIS. That first data report won't occur until spring of 2020. So again, setting out the timeline, use the standard methodology in school year 18-19, reserve funds for significant disproportionality in 1920, and report which LEAs have reserved funds in 2021. There are other data reporting requirements. The department is in the process of developing information collection requests for them, and we expect to have them finalized in 2017. So that brings us to the conclusion of the detailed discussion, and I'll pass it back to Ruth to wrap up.
Thanks to Richelle and Michael for their detailed walkthrough of the standard methodology, the remedies, and the dates. We appreciate the opportunity to provide you with this information and recognize all of the work that you are doing in states and locals to prepare for implementing the rule. Just a reminder that we did release an FAQ document that talks about the requirements in more detail, and that is available on OSEP Ideas That Work, along with the first webinar, which was an overview of the Equity and IDEA final rule, and then this webinar is also there, and this is about implementing the final rule. The other document that you will find there that I think you will see to be helpful is a suggested timeline. This is not a mandatory timeline that you must follow, but it is a suggested timeline that includes the activities that we have determined that you need to complete in order to be ready for full implementation on July 1st of 2018. Also, as you look at the FAQ and listen to the webinars, if you have additional questions, please send those in to us at significant disproportionality rule at ed.gov. We are regularly monitoring that mailbox and gathering the questions that are coming in and using them to help us prepare future guidance and future webinars. Thank you for all that you do every day on behalf of children with disabilities, and good afternoon.